I'm Melissa Jones, and I'm the vice chair for the Region 3 SAC, which many of you know. I've seen y'all in person before. Unfortunately, Jason couldn't be here tonight. He's dealing with a family emergency. So we just wish him the best as we go forward. I talked earlier with Patrick and some others from the planning committee about maybe canceling tonight because of the weather. And we really thought that this was an important topic and that we had these guest speakers coming, and that hearing what they have to say is just a good thing. If we can keep the process going, maybe this would allow for some more public input. If people wanted to join, they didn't have to feel the pressure to come, and we could all just be safe staying off the road. So I definitely appreciate the flexibility that everybody had today with joining us on this different platform. We have an exciting agenda planned. I just wanted to do a couple reminders on some just basic etiquette for when you're in a meeting. It's really easy to take your phone or your computer off of mute and forget, and then have background distractions in the background. So if we could just try to keep our microphones on mute when we're not speaking, I think it'll just help the thing run a lot more smooth. And then we'll see these presentations. It's all about housing today. And I think I'm just excited to jump into it. So Patrick, if you have any more announcements or things that you'd like to kick off with, we can roll right in.
I do have one announcement that I was going to make. One thing we have put into your the SAC Google Drive that you all have access to, we have put a spreadsheet in there of public comments that we are getting, and we're going to continue updating that through the process. It's actually pretty comprehensive. It has all of the comments that we've gotten on our public questionnaires, but also emails that we're getting and phone calls that we're getting, and some of the questions that are being asked, and then our responses. So that will be important for you all as we go forward in the process. There's not a lot that's super, I don't know, interesting right now, but later, particularly when we get into dealing with comprehensive zoning applications and processing those, we're going to get a lot of input from people, either in support of or potentially opposing certain applications. And there are going to be letters that are sent to the SAC, and that is how we will communicate those with you. We're going to organize them all into that spreadsheet, and you'll be able to see them that way. So look for that in the Google Drive. I will include that link when we email you all the next round, and that way you'll have a direct link to it that way as well. I do have a couple of other announcements. So I'm going to save that till the very end in our next steps portion of the meeting. So that's all that I have. And Alyssa, if I can kind of turn it back over to you for the approval of the last meeting's meeting notes. Did I catch you when you were
eating? Find that unmute button.
Sorry.
So at our last meeting, we have the notes, and I would like to go forward with approving the notes, the meeting minutes. If anybody would like to have an extra time to look over them, they were sent out in the meeting reminder for today's meeting. And if there's not any objections or anything that needs added, then we can vote to approve those meeting minutes. Does anybody
to approve?
Have a motion to approve? Any seconds?
Second.
Got Dawn on the second. All right, all in favor, say aye.
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 Thumbs up.
Aye.
Easy enough. All right,
right.
thank you very much. I see Joanne joined us too. Great. Thanks a lot. So let me go ahead and move into our presentation portion. And what I'm gonna do is share my screen. And we have 4 speakers who are joining us tonight. And I'm sorry I didn't coordinate with you all. Does it work for you all for me to just share the one presentation from my screen, and you all can just tell me when to advance to the next slide? Does that work for all of our speakers, for me to do it that way?
Yes.
Okay, Okay. So let me share my screen. And I'm going to start with a little intro here. So can everybody see my screen now? Thumbs up. Okay. I had a few reminders. Alyssa pretty much, I think, covered this. You all are, of course, visible as panelists. Thanks for being flexible and doing it this way. If any, I don't think anybody's on their phone, but if you are on your phone, please keep yourself muted to avoid background noise, like Alyssa said. But if you're on your phone, muting and unmuting is *6. I'll always forget that. And feel free to use the chat to communicate with our staff, and Andrew and Desiree are watching that. Our meeting's being recorded, and it's going to be posted at our website, aacounty.org/region3. And then we do have some attendees, I think 4 or 5, who are members of the public who are attending. So the chat is not monitored during the meeting, but we do have a public comment period at the end of the meeting that if you have any thoughts, anything you'd like to share with us, you can do so at that time. So our topic tonight is housing, and we have several speakers who have graciously joined us to share their expertise on this, on what affordable housing is, what some of the barriers are, specifically in our region. We're going to talk a little bit about missing middle housing and what that is. One of the things, because we've had to go virtual because of the weather thing, we had wanted to break out into small groups and have some targeted discussions on 2 different geographic areas of the region. We think it's pretty important to do that in person. It's a lot easier, and the conversation really flows when people can gather around a table and be pointing at a map and that kind of stuff. So we actually want to hold that small group discussion for an in-person opportunity. And I'm not sure exactly if that's going to be perhaps in our next meeting that we do that, or we work it into one of the subsequent meetings. But I think it's an important conversation to allow you all to have, and want to try to save that portion for an in-person piece. But we thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and have the meeting tonight. There's a lot of really great information that we're going to hear. So let's go forward with that. I'm going to start really quickly by kind of setting a little bit of the stage about what some of the fundamentals for the major players and the roles in the development of housing. This is a diagram from Howard County's comprehensive planning process, but really there are 5 key pieces that sort of influence the creation of housing. One, of course, is willing property owners, those who own property, and they're going to determine whether they're going to build on their property. They're going to decide whether to subdivide their property, if that's allowed under the zoning code, or whether to put their property or a portion of it into conservation. Then there's, of course, the market and the market demand for housing. We hear a lot of comments about, who's buying all of these big, new, expensive homes that are being built. And there's a lot of research that supports the market demand, and they do tend to sell for top dollar. So the private market primarily builds to meet that demand. We have the government as a key player in the housing market, and the government really sets the guardrails and kind of the rules of the game. So while our groups like ACDS and the Arundel Housing Commission, they do fund and build housing, overall it's kind of a small number compared to what is done by private developers who are working within those guardrails that are set by the government through our zoning code and development code. Private developers, they take on some of these projects. They'll do things like assemble smaller pieces of property into one larger piece. They'll design and go through the permitting process and manage construction and sale of housing units. And then, of course, the lending community, they're kind of in the background, but play an important role in financing, whether it's through loans or equity, and making sure that investors are confident that a project is going to be successful and give them a return on their investment. Now, within, I'll talk a little bit about the process for developing housing within Anne Arundel County. Now, I'm in the long-range planning division of Office of Planning and Zoning, as is Desiree and Andrew with me. But we do have a separate development division within the Office of Planning and Zoning that administers development projects and administers the review of development projects as they are submitted to our office for approval. So I'm just going to give a very big picture overview of the process. There are a lot of details that that even I am not that aware of, but big picture, I think, is probably enough. In Anne Arundel County, there are really two separate processes for development. So first is the top in green. If a project is coming in for subdivision, where a new parcel is going to be created out of a larger property, those go through two phases: sketch plan and final plan. And there's a review and approval at each of those two stages. And plans that are submitted, they lay out the lots, the location of infrastructure for housing units, stormwater management, landscaping, all of those sorts of things. Community meetings are required at each of those two stages of the process. And review is conducted by multiple county agencies, including the Office of Planning and Zoning, but also inspections and permits, the fire marshal, transportation, recreation and parks. All of these agencies and more take a look at these reviews, and they either approve them or don't as they're submitted to us. Now, if new lots don't need to be created for a development, then that goes through what's called the site development process, and that's in blue below. So say an apartment building or a commercial building that's just going to be built on a lot that's already existing, that goes through a preliminary plan and a site development plan process. And those plans, just like the other process, they detail where the building is going to be located, the scale, the infrastructure, and then there are community meeting requirements at each of those two stages, and also the multiple agencies that review and provide comments and either approve or don't approve that process. So after a development project gets through those two stages here, then they will move on to getting their grading permit and then building permit. The grading permit is where the engineering details are really fleshed out for water and sewer infrastructure, grading and erosion control and all of that. And then the building permit will be issued. So like I said, community meetings are required in most circumstances, particularly when a development is adjoining a residentially zoned and developed lot. And the first community meeting happens in the 6-month period before the initial submission of the development project or development proposal, and then within 45 days after the submission of this final plan or the site development plan. Now, so that's how all development happens in the county. The process for affordable housing is very much the same. Affordable housing projects have to meet the same code requirements as all of the market rate housing. So they also have to meet all of the forest conservation requirements, the stormwater management, adequate public facilities for transportation, fire and water. There are now exceptions for school testing for adequate public facilities. APF school standards aren't applicable for affordable housing where there are deed restrictions that are being put in place, or workforce housing, housing for elderly of moderate means, and a handful of other types of developments. But there are a few recent code reforms on these requirements that help support affordable and workforce housing, and we'll touch on those in a little bit in some of these presentations. But it's important to kind of understand this process, because alongside this development review and permitting process, affordable housing developers have to go through the process of obtaining financing to make their projects financially feasible. And without charging market rate rent, most of the affordable housing projects have to cobble together different federal, state, and local funding subsidies so that these projects will pencil out. And our affordable housing developers are going to talk a little bit more about this, but I just wanted to kind of give a sense of what it is that the hoops that they have to jump through, as well as other developers as they're going through this process. And sometimes the funding requirements that they need in order to make these projects work can sometimes be in conflict with some of the timelines for the development process that are required here at the county. So that's it in a quick nutshell. And at this point, I'm just going to turn it over, if I can, to our first speaker, who is Aaron Karpowitz from Arundel Community Development Services. So Aaron, if you'll take it away and just let me know when to advance slides.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm Erin Karpowitz. I'm the CEO of Arundel Community Development Services. And I apologize in advance if you hear a bunch of banging. I was planning to be at this meeting tonight in person, and then with the weather, I rushed home to get home in time, but I have contractors here doing work. So I apologize. And I don't want to let my contractors go because we know how hard it is to get contractors to finish sometimes. So anyway, if you want to go to the next slide, Patrick, my organization, Arundel Community Development Services, is the county's nonprofit housing and community development agency. We're kind of quasi-government, where we administer programs on behalf of Anne Arundel County, where we're helping to create affordable housing opportunities and community development opportunities for a lot of low and moderate income areas and underserved residents in the county. But we're also working with the county to identify great policies to help a range of different incomes afford housing, but mostly concentrated on households that are earning low incomes and moderate incomes. So when we talk a little bit about missing middle, we'll kind of get into that. That's kind of the whole continuum of households at the moderate range and below that we're interested in creating those opportunities for. I just want to give a little bit of data to kind of set the stage on how the affordability crisis is affecting Anne Arundel County, much like much of the nation and the rest of Maryland. The latest numbers I've heard is Maryland is about 91,000 units short on the number of affordable housing units it has to serve residents throughout Maryland. And in Anne Arundel County, we're dealing with a lot of the same. We have in our county about 45% of all renters. That means regardless of their income levels, are cost burdened. That means that they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing. So that means, you know, if you've got to pay 30% of your income for, or more than 30% of your income, that means less money that you can spend on groceries, on transportation, on clothes for your kids or activities for your kids and other necessities. And of course, this impacts people at the lower end of the spectrum more than it does people who are earning higher incomes. So 45% are paying more than 30%, and actually 19% of all renters, regardless of income, are paying more than 50% of their income. So they're severely cost burdened. So renters are particularly vulnerable because they tend to have lower incomes, but it's still an issue for people who are at that moderate level and maybe who want to and maybe are ready to move into home ownership. It's really difficult to find an affordable home to purchase, especially for those households that are maybe just starting out. So you might have, you know, a young couple, maybe some of you have young adult children who are looking for a home. It's hard for them to find a home. Older adults who maybe are ready to downsize from a larger home, but it's hard for them to find a home even that they can afford, especially at today's interest rates. So one of the statistics I have up on the screen is we know that housing prices have just shot up. And regardless of interest rates, they're still really high. From 2017 to 2022, that's the most recent year that I have a full set of yearly data for. The median home price rose by 35%, while the median income at that time for the same time period rose just 17.3%. So you know, housing is really hard to find if you're looking to buy. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute when I talk about some of our programs. And again, that's, you know, we're typically, when we're talking about homeowners or home buyers rather, we're usually talking about people who are making about 80 to 100% of area median income. That's who we're trying to help. So for a family of 4, that's a household that's making about 116,000. Between, you know, if you're talking 80%, it's maybe, you know, 90,000 to 116,000 is in that range. At the same time, I just want to point out too, rental prices have risen dramatically over that same or over the last 3 years, from about $1,566 a month to almost $1,900 by the end of 2022. So in that 3-year period, there's been a huge dramatic increase in rent. So this is affecting people at the lowest income, but it's also affecting some of our essential workers, you know, our construction workers, our service and retail workers, our nursing assistants, our paraprofessionals in the schools, some of our first-year teachers. It's really challenging. You can go to the next slide, Patrick.
Okay, if I can interject real quick, one thing I failed to mention was we are going to have a panel question and answer period after all of these presentations. I do see we have one hand raised from one of our committee members. So if that works for everybody, should we maybe jot down any questions for the panelists, and let's take them at the end of all of these presentations. Does that work for everyone?
That works for me because I can't see anybody whose hands are raised. So
yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. So there's the next slide.
So I want to talk about what is affordable housing, and because Patrick kind of made a distinction about, you know, affordable housing developments and the development process for those. And I think, you know, it's important. Yes, there are what we call affordable housing developments, and you'll hear from some of my colleagues that develop what we traditionally think of as affordable housing, that maybe it has government financing in it that then puts restrictive covenants and deeds on the property to ensure that it remains affordable for a certain number of years. Usually that's between 30 and 40 years. And it's serving households that are typically that housing, you know, if we're talking about low income housing tax credit funded projects or projects that are funded with our new affordable housing trust fund. Typically, if we're talking about rental projects, those are going to be serving people earning about 60% of area median income and below. And so for a family of 4, that's about, I think it's about $68,000 a year for that family. I might be misquoting that. I'll get it and put it in the chat when I finish speaking, but because I forgot my notes at the office, and I don't have that chart memorized, but those units are restricted. But there's also a range of affordable housing. Everybody needs affordable housing, right? It just is if you're at the higher income range, if you're making $300,000 a year, you know, your affordability is much greater and you can afford a lot more. So there are also people in the middle incomes that need affordable housing, and they don't want to, they shouldn't be paying more than around 30 to 40% of their income on affordable housing. So there are market rate housing options. So when we talk about you know, land use policies and other government policies that help spur the development of more units and help spur the supply, that really helps everybody, regardless of what income you are at, in order to increase the supply and put some downward pressure on pricing, whether it be for rental or for home ownership. And the county has a number of tools in the toolbox to do that. Patrick mentioned the APF laws for schools. It specifically exempts affordable units developed with some of those government financing programs, but it also expands the ability to create some units on the market rate side as well. You know, there's different terminology like affordable and workforce, and you know, again, a lot of times it just depends on what you're talking about. But when we're talking about some of the government programs, we're talking about housing that's affordable to people at 60% of AMI. A lot of times when we're talking about our programs that help homeowners or would-be homeowners, we're talking about housing that is helping or affordable to people earning 100% of area median income. I mentioned the rental housing that's supported by low-income housing tax credits through the state of Maryland. My office also runs a program where we not only provide first-time homebuyer counseling, but we also provide down payment and closing cost assistance for those purchasers. But the problem is they have to go and find a house, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then we also have a workforce housing zoning provision. That's one of the tools that the county has implemented in the last 5 years that allows developers, whether it be our more traditional tax credit developers like Jessica and Andrew, who you're going to hear from in a minute, or market rate developers who maybe are looking for new ways or new places to purchase land and develop new units. It helps them by expanding the range of ways they can develop, or the number of it expands the different options where they can purchase and develop residential units. So in commercial districts, in some commercial districts and some light industrial districts and mixed use districts, as well as lower residential zone districts starting at R5 and R10 and R15, you can create up to 22 units per acre if a certain percentage of the units are made affordable to people earning at a certain income level, depending on whether it's rental or home ownership. So that's a tool, and we've seen we've had one project close on financing, and we're seeing some other projects come in. So that's great. But I sincerely believe that if we're going to create more units for every income range, we need some more, we need to open up some more land and more zoning options. The next slide. This is, and I'm not going to get into detail about this because I think my colleagues from the development community are probably going to talk more about this. But this just shows, like, if we're working on a project where we're providing subsidies to help that project be affordable, and then we're going to in turn restrict the incomes. This is how it works. Affordable developers that are utilizing low-income housing tax credit, or that are using our housing trust fund dollars, they have a certain operating expenses that they have to be able to meet, as well as be able to pay for debt service or loans and pay back those loans. But if they have affordable financing that they don't either A, don't have to pay back, or B, are paying back at a lower rate, that allows them to get more capital, and but then in turn that also allows them to accept lower rent payments, where the market might be up here and theirs is down here. And I think that planning and zoning is going to provide this slide deck so you can look at this in more detail. As you see, it's a little bit outdated because it's quoting a 3.75% interest rate, which is I think we're well above that right now. But you can go to the next slide, Patrick. I want to give some examples of a few affordable units or affordable communities that are affordable to people that are earning 60% of area median income and below. I see some chatter in the chat. I will post our income limits for you when I finish my presentation so you can see. But again, the 60% is families that are making around, I want to say 65%, and then 100% of area median income is about 118%. Again, that's for a family of 4, and HUD adjusts those income limits by family size. And so we utilize those for the Baltimore metropolitan statistical area here in Anne Arundel County. And I have the specific ones that I can post for you. This is Oakwood Family Homes, and I'm not sure if this is in this planning region, but it is a beautiful community. It's 22 units, single family detached rental units. And these are rental units that can then be the tenants, if they're interested, they can actually enroll to be homeowners one day. And these are really beautiful. 78% of the residents in this community are active in the workforce. A lot of them are also retired or have a disability, and the rent is very affordable. You can go to the next. And this is Marley Meadows. This is an affordable rental community that's about 36 units, and it's serving older adults. And it's also in the Glen Burnie area. And it is probably, I think it's about 12 years old, and it's a beautiful community. So this is just kind of showing that these affordable communities that have income restrictions, necessarily what you think of when you think of, you know, public housing of days gone by. We used to say it's not your grandmother's public housing. They're beautiful communities that fit into with the character, and they have a lot of they're meeting a lot of the income needs of the residents in the area. Next slide. Also, in addition to providing some financing for development partners to create those affordable rental units, we have first-time homebuyer counseling. This is free to any Anne Arundel County household or someone who's looking to purchase in Anne Arundel County, regardless of their income. We provide this for free. We have a down payment and closing cost assistance program that I mentioned, and it's very generous in that it provides up to $50,000 in funding, and it's zero interest and it's deferred payment. So you don't pay any of that back until you sell your home or refinance. We have about 400 active households per year in our home ownership counseling program. But unfortunately, we only have this past year, we had about 10 households that were able to purchase homes. Now, some of the households enrolled in our program may not qualify because they may not meet the income restrictions, but a lot of them do. They just can't find affordable units. And you probably know some people that you work with, or that you know, are family members with, or are friends with, that it's very difficult for them to find units, even if they might have good credit. A lot of times that's an obstacle. People don't have good credit, but they work one-on-one with our experienced housing counselors. But it's really hard for them to find. Next slide. And again, I think this boils down to the fact this tight and just really difficult market to find affordable home ownership units as well as affordable rental units boils down to a lack of supply. And so I'm really grateful that the current county administration has helped us grow our toolkit. They've provided funding resources that help us go and provide some support through loans to developers who are creating affordable rental units. And then we can also use that money for the mortgage write-down program, mortgage assistance program I mentioned, as well as to help provide some subsidies to create and develop affordable units. We have some county general funds and federal home funds that we leverage to do that as well. There's also an opportunity to provide a discount for property taxes for some of the affordable rental units. There's some other incentives with some reduction in fees if a project is developed by a nonprofit. And then also there have been from time to time opportunities for us to leverage county surplus property to develop affordable homes. That's kind of on the financing side. And then on the land use side, you know, we've implemented things like the workforce housing zoning provision that I already mentioned, where you can develop residential units and commercial and mixed use, and then also upzone in certain residential units if a certain percentage are made affordable. We also have the adequate public facility requirement for schools that was removed for affordable units and some improvements to the general law. And then we also had a policy that was passed in the last year that allows accessory dwelling units on parcels where there is an existing home. So those are all good things, tools in the toolbox, but alone, any one of those alone is not going to solve the issue. And we need some more things. Inclusionary zoning, or you might have heard about the essential workers housing bill. A lot of people call that moderately priced dwelling unit policy. Unfortunately, that failed to pass early this year in the council. Or I guess I should say late, it was defeated late last year in December. I'm hoping that makes a comeback, because that really helps to create more affordable housing opportunities wherever residential development is occurring. And I think that's important because there are a lot of communities in the county that have like really no affordable development. Your district has, you're carrying a lot of the county's affordable development in your district already. I think, other areas don't have it, and this would it would create a requirement there where just a small percentage, not a huge percentage, but a small percentage, 10 to 15% of all development would be required to be affordable for people making moderate incomes. And then finally, I think another tool that we really need to do to explore is to create more land, zone more land for higher densities throughout the county, but especially in areas where it makes sense, right, next to transit and other infrastructure. And that will really help us create those affordable units and also meet the different demographics and the changing market preferences of our aging population and our younger population that may not want big houses and single family developments. So I really, in case I don't get to say it later during the discussion, I really challenge folks to support policies like the MPDU or Essential Worker Bill if it does make a reappearance, and I hope it does. And I also really encourage you to get involved with planning and zoning's comprehensive rezoning process and really speak up and say, yeah, we want affordable housing for all, attainable housing for a range of incomes, not just low income and not just high income, but a range of incomes. And we want that in our community so that we can have, our teaching assistants and other essential workers living in our communities. And that's, I think, all. I don't think I have another slide, do I, Patrick?
I think you're at the end, and yeah. So what we can do, let's like I said, let's hold questions. We're going to have a panel discussion where you all can take any questions from our committee members. Let's get through our remaining speakers though really quickly, if that's okay. So next up, I will introduce Jessica Zuniga, and I will let you go ahead and start. And same deal, if you will just tell me when to advance the slideshow, if that works for you, then we can go that way. Is Jessica still with us?
I'm here.
Oh, there we are. Okay, good.
And you can
All right,
you can go ahead to my next slide too, and we'll jump right in.
Okay.
So, hi everybody. Thank you for having me this evening. And Andrew Hansen is with me, and I'll do the other half of our presentation. So I'm from Foundation Development. We do have a project that's under construction right now that you'll see a little later. And I think if we talk a little bit more specifically about that, I think you'll start to really see some of the issues that we're raising come to life. I did a presentation to another region probably about 1.5 years ago, and I started with a slide and a presentation that probably was pretty drab and scary with where we were. And so I thought it was really great to update sort of the doomsday slide that I started with last year. And I changed it to way to go AAC. because the county has made a lot of really important changes. Obviously not all in the last year and a half, but I think, you know, really sort of acknowledging, I have been talking to people in the county and even, you know, consultants that were hired by the county for years and years and years about schools and infrastructure and zoning and blah, blah, blah. So to see all these things now, I think is really exciting and is a huge step. So, you know, our complaint has always been there's just not a lot of R22, right? And so, you know, having this workforce housing conditional use that's now in 11 zoning districts, and recent changes have been made to try to increase the density that can be built, you know, on those properties by changing the coverage a little bit, you know, adding a different level of service road, which expanded the opportunities more, I think was really important for us to have more opportunities to build apartments. And we'll talk a little bit about the product type that we typically build and why high density zoning is really required. You know, the county is a high cost area. I think we all understand that. It's appealing. People want to live here. The property taxes are low. So you have affordable housing developers competing with people who can sell $500,000 houses or, you know, have a 1-bedroom apartment for $2,000 a month. And we just can't pay the same. Right. So the county has worked hard to offset some of the expense for us, you know, cutting the capital surcharges by 50%, you know, trying to provide a clear process for payment in lieu of taxes. And then obviously some of the new loan programs that Aaron talked about. And then the school APFO mitigation, which is essentially an exemption for workforce housing or affordable housing, I think are, you know, have just been really key barriers for us as an industry. Next slide, Patrick. So talking about cost, I think is, you know, kind of remains a big issue. So because we cannot compete with market rate developers, we are getting properties that I like to call have 3+ problems, right? So that they're not the most ideal properties. They're not beautiful green sites that we can come in and we meet the county's code, which is incredibly suburban. We are getting the difficult stuff, the hard stuff that everybody has already passed over. And through perseverance, frankly, we are finding ways to get it done. So I think, you know, anything, and one of the things we talked about when I presented last time, you know, is like the forest conservation legislation that was passed, I think about 2 years ago now. You know, it just automatically kind of downzoned the density available in land, you know, so anything that's anti-development, if you truly want to encourage affordable housing, you have to think through the effect that has on affordable housing. And, you know, again, because we can't compete for these large, easy plots of land, you know, we're usually trying to shoehorn. And Marley Meadows, I think, is a great example that Aaron pointed out. I actually developed that at another company, and, you know, it's 36 units shoved into an acre. Like these are the deals we're doing, right? So, you know, we're not, the idea, and that kind of goes to my next point, which is, you know, that the county's code really doesn't have a lot of flexibility when it comes to incredibly dense product, you know, redevelopment sites, you know, trying to take a square peg and shove it in a round hole, which is what we do. That is our business. So I wanted to just identify, like, you know, that some of the MXD zones, you know, some of the overlays that exist, you know, trying to look to more opportunities and flexibility there, I think is a way to try to start dealing with some of the redevelopment sites and the types of projects that you see from people like us. And then I don't want to talk too much about the process and the timing and things, as Andrew's going to cover that, but I did want to point out, you know, our financing structures, you know, Aaron started to talk to that a little bit. They're very complicated. They probably take as long as the land development process. And so, I mean, we start these things and we could spend 24 months just going through that process alone. One of the things that has been very popular with the state DHCD, who allocates funding to most of us, and we were primarily talking about low-income housing tax credit projects. They have liked this thing where they want us to buy bigger sites and do 2 different financing packages, because all of the financing essentially has limits as to how much you can get. So it shrinks our project sizes. We have a project under construction right now that is part age restricted with one financing package and general occupancy with the other financing package. But the county's requirements for age restricted housing requires that it be on its own parcel. So we had to go through the process of subdividing a parcel that was really, you know, one package, so to speak, you know, one project, one land development plan. We had to go through and subdivide it so that we had separate parcels. So now we incurred more cost. We now have to have 2 access points. We have to have separate everything. You know, we now have separate meters and separate parcels, and you know, we had to pay a lot of attorneys and all these, you know, and engineers, right? So the only people who got rich on this were the attorneys and the engineers, which is always the story. So I think, you know, things like that, just kind of, you know, asking, have they outlived their purpose and their usefulness for why they were added, and you know, those types of things are I just, my take in having worked in the county for the past 15 years is that the code is ready for new. That's kind of my take at this point. That's my last slide. Patrick, I'll call up Andrew.
Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. So yeah, at this point, I can pass it over to Andrew Hansen. Andrew, are you with us still? And
I'm here. Good evening.
great, thank you. I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks. And you can advance to the next slide. And you know, I can sort of supplement what Aaron and Jessica have shared, and I can provide some specifics, but it feels like it might be better to sort of provide rather some generic overviews, and then happy to answer questions. So the primary product that Jessica and I and others use is a federal resource administered by the state housing office. You'll hear it referred to different things, but it's really Department of Housing Community Development. There's different buckets of money that's available, but generally there's a competitive resource. That's the low-income housing tax credit, although in reality, it's serving a whole range of different incomes. The reference to AMI, area median income, was one of those whereby when you're competing for these resources, you're trying to receive the highest score, and the program incentivizes you to serve, you know, the very low income folks. But from a timing perspective, the state has typically 1 round a year. It used to be more rounds, but generally there's 1 round a year, and everyone submits an application for a project in a site. I believe there was 3 applications in this past round in Anne Arundel County for folks that wanted to develop affordable communities, and so that'll be reviewed. It's a pretty lengthy process. It takes a lot of time to put together an application. You have to identify a site. You have to have site control. You have to design, you know, sort of a preliminary. Does the building lay out? Does the site lay out? Are there utilities? All the other things that go into development, and submit that to the agency for their review. So, you know, it can take 6 months or more to sort of put that together, and then you're waiting for the housing agency to do their review. And if they get back to you in 90 days, then comes probably the 24-month time that Jessica talked about, whereby you are, not only are you working through all the approvals with the county, but you're also working through with the lenders, with the investors, you're working through with all the different pieces, while you're also trying to make sure that the design of the building progresses, by the design of the site progresses. You're working on, you know, receiving pricing from your contractor. You're negotiating with the property management folks. All the pieces have to come together, and it's a pretty lengthy process. It's quite involved. I think we're fortunate because in Anne Arundel County, I think I said this at a presentation a few months ago, but for the most part, Anne Arundel County has not set up too many ways for constituents to object to affordable housing. There are other communities around where if someone wants to fight your development and they don't like it, even if it's by right, even if the zoning's appropriate, even if you've met all the approvals, they still have a way to get in in the process and sort of slow it down or try and stop it. So thankfully, Anne Arundel County has done a good job of trying to curb that. But in order to get to closing, we've gone through the process. We've got all the approvals from the county. We've got, the lenders and investors on board. We've got the permit ready to be issued or issued. And all those things have to come into play when you go to your construction closing, which is when you then build the project, which, has become an even bigger challenge with the availability of resources, lumber and all the other materials, as well as things like switch gears, which is a fancy piece of equipment that gets installed in your building that helps the power be supplied to the units. Or maybe it's transformers that the power company has to set. So those are all things we have to try and plan ahead for and sort of have a successful path, because we've got a limited period of time during which we can build the project, switch its construction financing over to the permanent financing, and hopefully lease it up. Generally, there's lots of interest and demand because, as Aaron said, there's such a shortage of affordable housing. Sometimes the financing can make things a little bit more complicated because it's very specific. You're serving maybe certain households or certain incomes that are, somewhat of a struggle, or maybe there's a special referral that has to be made. So those are all the different nuances. I have worked on a few different projects in Anne Arundel County. I haven't been able to start from the beginning to the end, but I've been involved in a few. And as Jessica said, these affordable housing communities are treated like other communities in that we have to go through the approval process and, address comments and basically there's really not special treatment given to affordable housing. So we certainly have to go through that process. And to the extent that ways could be found to expedite things, since there's such a great need, that certainly would be appreciated. I'm sure I've left something out because this presentation was done in the past by one of my colleagues who retired. So Jessica, if I've overlooked something and you want to supplement, feel free to chime in.
I think the one thing I would want to maybe dig a little bit deeper in that you said, and because I do think it's important when we talk about the process, is just our business has what I would call artificial timeframes as opposed to developers in reality. I know that sounds funny, but it's true. And the county has this: we first do this, and then you're allowed to do this, and then you're allowed to do this type of process. And we have to run everything concurrently because the financing process that Andrew and I are both talking about, when everybody finally looks up and is like, go, we have to go. That means everything, all go, everything. We need to have final architect plans. We need to be in building for permits. We need land development plans. And when you have a sort of an individual step process, it really is not a process that we can do well. We have to take the risk and run everything concurrently. All engineering, all land development, all public works. And it is, having closed a project with the county recently, it gets everybody out of sync, and then you end up with problems, and then you end up with slowdown, so it's just kind of having an understanding, even if it's not a traditional process for you all, just understanding that there are some developers who do need to do everything at once because we cannot close on our financing unless we have absolutely every approval in hand, including building permit approval, right? And there's a lot of developers who pull their grading permit and they go out and they do their site work, and then they come back for a building permit. We cannot do that. Everything that it takes to put a shovel in the ground and complete that project, we have to have in hand. And so that's also sort of a process piece that I think is really important to actually getting the project closed and under construction. And then I'll give my personal complaint of requiring property owners to sign documents that they don't have approvals for. It's very hairy. As the developer and as the permitted entity, the county just refuses to allow the developers who actually are getting the approvals in their name to sign documents like public works agreements and restrictions and things. And we were very fortunate that we had a seller who was willing to hold our hand and just kind of go along with us. But there have been scenarios where we're forced to buy property beforehand, and that's just not I wouldn't even call it not an ideal situation. It's not feasible sometimes to buy the property before you have the financing in hand. So I think that is, and Aaron and I had a long conversation because we actually closed the first workforce housing conditional use. And, I think there's a question for the county, particularly when you're talking about workforce housing. If you approve a certain developer and owner and a certain plan, do you want an owner who knows nothing about affordable housing, who doesn't have those plans? Do you want them to have approvals that anybody could step into? And I think I personally have a strong opinion about affordable housing and workforce housing, and people who know how to do it and understand the resident base and the support that they need. I feel strongly that from a public policy perspective, it's really important to have people who do this for a living do it, or you'll have problems where everybody will think that all of your workforce housing is bad. So.
Thank you all. If that is the end of your presentation at this point, we will, I'm sure, have questions for you all when we have our question and answer period. I'm looking to see, are there any other slides? Was there more that you all wanted to talk about?
I think we had, and Aaron did a good job of kind of going through, some of the existing communities in the county. So we just brought a few. I brought an example project that's under construction now that is the first workforce housing conditional use project. If we wanted to talk about that specifically,
is that Burger Square? Burger Square is in Odenton, I believe, correct?
It is, and that's
then,
existing.
Yeah, Glen Forest, is that let me see. So I'm just scrolling through some of the slides that you had presented. Should I just continue
Sure.
This way? Okay. Stop me. I'll let you narrate.
So the Eagle Park communities, of which we have Eagle Park Village and Eagle Park Vistas, they're the first workforce housing communities, that the first true workforce housing conditional use communities that are approved and under construction right now. This is the one that I mentioned where we had to subdivide the site because half of it is general occupancy and the other half is age restricted. So that if we want to talk a little bit more about that project, that's this project, and it was a fun ride. It was really fun. It was in it's in an MXD zone. It was originally approved as office, so we had to get a number of text amendments done before we could even propose workforce housing as a conditional use. So it was quite a brain bender. And that's why I say we need perseverance, because we're taking chances on stuff that nobody else wants to or can figure out.
And Patrick, if you just want to back up a couple of slides to Burger Square, I think it's helpful to see another example of another recent project. I think one more before that. And just to point out to everyone that although this is affordable, it was built with high standards, as basically the process and the financing requires. Is it's built with quality materials. It's designed to be complementary to the community, and I think the standards have only gotten more stringent. So there's a lot of brick here. There's Hardy. There's Energy Star appliances, windows. This is really designed to effectively be almost luxury housing. We don't put in generally swimming pools and some of the other over-the-top amenities, but this is we're proud to build this and offer it to folks and have the rent be achievable. So that's just one little snippet there of Burger Square that Homes for America built in Odenton.
Great. Thank you all very much for that. And I think at this point, what I would recommend that we do is, if I can shift over to Spencer Shanholtz, who is a colleague of ours in long-range planning with the Office of Planning and Zoning. he was going to give a little bit of background about missing middle housing, and then some data as it relates specifically to the county and to the region. So Spencer, are you with us and ready to move forward?
Yeah, I'm here. Yep.
Great. Okay.
Hi.
I'll turn it over to you and just tell me when to advance.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. As Patrick said, I'm Spencer Shanholtz. I'm also with Office of Planning and Zoning. I work in the same office with Patrick and Desiree and Andrew. I do a lot of our data and research kind of in the background. I'm not necessarily on a region team, but I'm happy to be here to give a little bit of information for you. What we wanted to do shortly here, a lot of this material is in your briefing paper that you were given. And it's also in a visual vocabulary document that I think was provided to you. So I'll just kind of give a high level overview here and give some context. But I wanted to distinguish, the term missing middle housing. You may have heard it in the media or around the urban planning world, but it's a new term that's been only used for about 10 years, but it's really an older form of housing. And you can see in this figure here, most due to market constraints or market demand and zoning constraints, a lot of development today is either done on that really low density spectrum, single family homes, or the really high dense spectrum. And then missing middle housing just really refers to these housing units that are kind of in that middle scale, hence that missing middle. And these were actually really common in the 1950s. You can see a lot of examples downtown Annapolis, old main streets, older towns that that may have those buildings that weren't built into the new zoning code and development regulations. Next slide, Patrick. So one of the reasons that missing middle has really been gaining popularity across the country is that it can really fit into existing single family neighborhoods and provide more opportunities for housing for different income levels. So it provides a diversity of housing types that fits kind of into our existing neighborhoods. So this slideshow shows examples of that, integrating missing middle into a neighborhood of single family homes. On the left, you see the existing neighborhood. On the right, you can see some missing middle housing types interspersed. And this could happen with the addition of ADUs or independent dwelling units on an existing lot, or the conversion of a single family home into duplex, triplex, fourplex, or even smaller multifamily units in that area on like a main street, maybe a transportation. You can see transportation corridor there in the blue. I'm going to go through a few examples. Like I said, you were provided a lot of these in the documents, so I'll go fairly quickly. But one of the types here is these courtyard buildings, and they're basically apartments or condos that can be developed around a shared community space. So really, they're essentially, we talked about the accessory dwelling units. They're a community of smaller, accessory dwelling units that can exist on one lot. And that's very difficult to develop in our zoning code right now. On the left is one that does exist in the county. It's a housing development in Galesville, which is down in South County. It was originally constructed as housing for local workers. It's now owned and managed by ACDS. So that's one example. Next slide. So these are kind of maybe what you would typically think of, especially on the right as missing middle. So that's a duplex on the right. Looks in scale as like a larger single family home, but the only difference is it has two doors. So it has two separate units in it and can provide for two different price points to two different families or households. On the left, you can see a fourplex, which is just another example. This is actually a senior housing community in North County. Next slide. And then a little bit bigger scale, you can see these multiplexes. They can sometimes be called mansion apartments. And they can have the facade of a large house. You might not even know that they are, many units inside. So some of them can be 5 to 12. These are on the larger side here shown. But they're typically 2 to 3 stories and share a shared entrance from the street. And they can really provide a transitional space between neighborhoods of different densities, from a larger apartment complex community into a single family home to, again, provide more options. Next slide. And lastly, we mentioned a lot about accessory dwelling units. They're sometimes called in-law apartments or secondary suites. And that was a recent bill that was passed last year, allowed standalone accessory dwelling units in the county. Previously, they were allowed as long as they were attached to the main building, like above a garage or a basement unit. But they're now allowed as standalone units if you wanted to develop with a few restrictions. So next slide. So kind of to wrap up here, missing middle, it can really is a tool that can increase the diversity of housing, but it's really important to distinguish that it might not necessarily meet affordable housing definitions. But like I said, it does provide a multitude of price points and allows more housing, creates downward pressure, opening up, housing across the unit. And really it can serve, your son who wants to, your child who wants to stay in the community, or an older person, an older resident, or even a small family who just is looking for something not so big. Another key point is supply. As these kind of zoning changes happen, or the supply of these types of things are really going to be modest at the beginning as market adjusts. This isn't typically going to be a large greenfield development coming in, building hundreds of units at a time. It's more interspersed, and it's going to be part of our toolbox to increase housing in the county by kind of doing it piece by piece, here and there. So it's not going to explode and be all of a sudden a lot. And we've seen that in jurisdictions around the country who have implemented some code changes. It's kind of a slow start, but it's a good one. And another thing is, the last thing are the challenges, like I've kind of mentioned in our current code. It really comes down to density. The only difference between a lot of these are, a couple, more than one door, but yet they become more than one, when they have more than one door, they have more than one unit in them. And then the way our code regulates housing is on density. So, what was once one unit is now two on the same amount of land. Explicitly allowing certain types in certain zones or designated areas without that density requirement is what a lot of other communities have done. Parking is an issue with these that a lot of people bring up. There's ways around that, allowing on-street parking rather than meeting, all the needs of parking on the lot, because that can become very restricting to developers and building if they have to provide, a lot of their lot has to be parking, or they have to create garages that go under, or, something along those lines. And lastly, the lot dimension standards are really kind of antiquated in a lot of codes around the country. The setbacks, widths, and some of these types of housing are difficult to squeeze into existing lots that way. And one way a lot of other communities have helped with this are developing a pattern book that provides some existing designs to developers that they could follow to build these types of housing, because they might not be familiar, and how they can fit within our county's code, and kind of maybe expedite that process a little bit. So that's it. And there's some more information in your briefing documents, and I'll turn it back over to Patrick.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers, Aaron, Jessica, Andrew, and you, Spencer. At this point, I'd like to open it up to our committee members. I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can actually have each other on the screen. And what I'd like to do is, if you all have any questions for our speakers, I know we had a couple of raised hands during the session, so maybe I can just open it up to you all, and if you want to raise your hand, and then we'll get you to unmute and ask your question. And I'm not seeing any
I just
raised
have
hand.
so many thoughts that I was writing, trying to type down as this was going, and just some questions I think that would help clarify some things for people. We talked about the AMI one a little bit in chat, but I didn't know that acronym right off the top either, so I was thrown off just a little. But then I had a lot of questions about that adequate public facilities, the APF requirements. So in both presentations, on the two presentations, it was seen like it was really, really a good thing to be taking away these requirements. But as just a community citizen, I think it's really important that we have the adequate facilities. And I think a lot of times the people that are against these types of developments and these types of affordable housing projects or bills that are going forward is because we don't think we have the adequate facilities, the roads, the school systems, and all these things. So removing those restrictions to me seems like it is not a good thing, though it's being said that it is. So I was just wondering if there was a little bit more clarification that might be able to go into that, because I know it's always good to lose restrictions if you're a developer and you want to make money on a project, but just in general, I just wonder how it's a good thing really if we're removing those restrictions, because I think the support is important in the long term.
Yeah, Patrick, can I go ahead and take a
Yes.
shot? And then I want to turn it over to you and your team to kind of clarify some of the details, because planning and zoning was really involved in making that change and really staffing a whole, the Office of Planning and Zoning staffed a whole commission that went on for, I think it was over a year or two. And you raised some good points, Ms. Jones, about that. Just to clarify, the school APF law that was adjusted, it affects the school APF requirements, and basically it kind of right sizes, I think, because after this commission met on, for over a year, they determined that a lot of the schools, most of the schools weren't in fact overcrowded, and there wasn't the right identification of how many students really were utilizing those schools. And so there was kind of this antiquated, I think it was antiquated requirement that you could not develop anything if the schools were just 95% full or utilized. And when in fact, most jurisdictions, all jurisdictions, I believe in the state, they had a requirement of 100% utilization and above. So it moved the needle to kind of what was in realm of what was really being utilized. But also the commission found that, or it wasn't a commission, it was a work group, but it included private citizens and a number of different stakeholders. But it also found that a lot of the data showed that it wasn't new development that it was contributing to school overcrowding. It's existing development, existing homes, and the turnover of those existing homes that was creating the school capacity issues in areas where there are school capacity issues.
Yeah, I will say that this was an interesting topic of conversation and a really interesting presentation that was done during the first round of Region Plan SAC, committee meetings, and I can share some of one of the recordings that was from one of our meetings where this was discussed, and I think you might find it really interesting to kind of help understand. But I will say the school exemptions, it's not always a blanket exemption for all of these projects to just not have to meet any school requirements. It's developments that meet certain requirements, whether they be in a certain geographic area, whether it's something like the Glen Burnie Sustainable Community Overlay area, and then if it's within that area, it would need to be a property that's located in a town center zoning district, and and then there are some other criteria that it has to meet. So it's kind of balancing, trying to meet the public good of providing affordable housing, but setting some guardrails on and in the form of criteria that certain projects have to meet in order to be able to gain that exemption from the school testing provisions. Those are all the exemptions are located in our code in Article 17, and I can send a link to that to you all if you'd like to kind of dig into that a little bit more, just to understand a bit more about that. Joanne, you have your hand up, so let me ask you to unmute and ask your question.
Okay, I actually had two questions, but one
Okay.
is, with affordable housing, is the unstated assumption that everyone who lives in Anne Arundel County should be able to live in Anne Arundel County? And if that is true, you know, what is the rationale for that, and what are the implications of if we did have that vision accomplished? Would the county still be desirable to live in terms of density of population? So I'm just asking, is this like an assumption that everyone has, that everyone who works in Anne Arundel County should be able to live in Anne Arundel County? And then the second part of my question is, I'm quite aware that there's controversy going on between the county executive and the county council regarding an Affordable Housing Act, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about what the issues are there. I really haven't been able to follow it all in depth, but I am quite aware that the county executive is very upset about it not passing, and I don't understand why the county council didn't pass it.
I can try to tackle that first piece a little bit. I don't think that there's a specific vision to ensure that everybody who works in the county necessarily can or does live within the county. I think it's a little bit more about trying to make sure that there are at least options for a lot of the workers who are in the county, and recognizing the fact that our market is kind of skewed toward a higher end, and there are a lot of folks who we do have a lot of high end jobs and employment centers in this county, and it's important for, of course, those folks to be able to ideally live near where they work, because that ends up being less traffic on our roadways because they're not having to drive through or across our county in order to get to work. But being also mindful of the need to make sure that our lower income or lower salaried or lower paid workers also have some options to be able to locate near some of these jobs that are in our county as well. And right now we seem to be pretty short on that supply in the county. So I think that's kind of where the vision or the focus, some of the energy is in trying to provide that. And the second, I'm sorry, I didn't write it down. The second part of your question, the tension between the council and the executive. I don't know, Aaron, is that something that maybe you could speak to a little bit better than I could?
I mean, I'm maybe, I don't know. I guess, I guess, you know, I think what happened with the essential workers bill, you know, there were a lot of different interests, and I think, you know, there were a lot of different ways to look at the bill and come at the bill. And I don't know that the development community was speaking from one voice. And so it was, I think that the administration made some, you know, made some changes to the bill to try to accommodate various interests, and tried to work on things. But I think that it was, in the end, we were running out of time to get it passed because of all the different amendments and everything. But I'm hopeful that the council and the administration will work together and bring back something that that will get passed. And I would just add,
Mhm.
you know, I do think that it's important that we want to ensure that people who work here in a range of jobs have the opportunity to live here. Yeah, are we going to be able to accommodate everybody? Maybe not. But and maybe not everybody who works here wants to live here. They may have a spouse or you know, that works in another jurisdiction or have roots somewhere else. But it's very skewed in that, you know, people who are on the lower end of the income scale, it's very difficult for them to find affordable units. And I know that when I'm talking to different people in the, you know, in the economic development realm, and I know when elected officials are talking to people, businesses and, you know, industry leaders in terms of tourism and other areas, hospitality, they say that their number one concern is their workforce and the affordability of housing. And it's hard for them to attract workers who can come in and work at the restaurants and you know, work in the schools. We know that our schools, like, it was really hard to attract teachers. We didn't have bus drivers. So what can we do to ensure that we have a workforce that does have some housing choices, so that the housing choices aren't just skewed towards the upper economic the upper ends of the economic scale.
Thank you. Michael, you have your hand raised. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Joanne said she's got 2 questions. I've got about 10 here, but I'll try to I'll try to work through this. So for the big question I saw from a lot of the speakers, they talked about the code for the county and how the housing code and some things seem antiquated. How does it go? How do you go about making changes to the code? And what input do they use to make the changes to the housing code? I guess that, you know, that's going to be a big question. It's going to lead into anything else. And also looking at the presentations, it seems like, you know, for the affordable housing, is there an incentive for builders to actually build the affordable housing without a government subsidy? So that's, you know, I'm wondering how that comes into play. And, you know, again, the yeah, you know, what are the incentives for builders to build affordable housing? And the other thing is, I'm looking at these spaces. I don't see a lot of open spaces for the various housing communities that are being built. They try to squeeze as many houses, you know, onto the lot as they can, and there's no, you know, public spaces, you know, like a park or anything. It seems like the developers are depending on the county or the rest of us to provide that space, as opposed to just the local spaces. I don't know if you've noticed that. And also, like, so where with the apartment buildings, I noticed that the parking, it seems like everything is right outside, you know, on a street level, right outside the apartment buildings. Why don't they build parking structures, parking garages for the cars to park in? That would solve the, you know, because single level parking takes up an awful lot of space. So that really eats into the amount of housing that you can have in a given area.
Why don't we go ahead and start
Sure.
Because I'm trying to take notes of the questions that you're asking, and
Gotcha.
we're gonna forget them if why don't we start tackling a couple of those. A couple of them are related to development, and I don't know, Jessica, maybe you might have some thoughts on the incentivizing builders. Certainly you could probably talk to parking structures and such, and maybe even open spaces and public spaces for some of the development that we're getting.
Okay. Am I taking the questions in order? I think the first
yeah.
question was really about I'll just call it modernizing the code, right? And I'll say, Mr. Young, there was the county had a long history of doing modifications to kind of get around some of these challenges, right? So they were sort of administrative modifications, and there was what I would say is a pretty good understanding of what would be approved and what wouldn't be approved. And I think there were routine modifications given out for a long time. And then we had a new planning and zoning director, and all of a sudden they stopped. And so I think, but if you're giving out, and I'm certainly not a planner, but what I've been told by planners is if you're giving out a ton of modifications, there's probably a problem with your code. So I guess that's probably where my thoughts are coming from on that, is that it's very hard to do anything based on the by right when you have sort of a creative situation.
Yeah, and I was going to circle back to as I understand it, the question was really, how to change the code, and it is I think a political process that any changes to the code have to be adopted by the county council. So that means it's either approaching a council member with an idea for an improvement, or the county executive, whoever it is that's elected at that time, may propose a change to the code as well. Sometimes we do have some studies that are going on from time to time from the planning and zoning staff, who will look to modernize and improve a section of the code, and will then approach the executive with their findings. Sometimes they will pull together a study group of both staff members and agency folks, and then also developers or others from outside who are experts in the area and who can kind of help point out ways to improve a certain section of the code, and then we'll shop that either through the executive or through council members to try to move through the legislative process. But ultimately, any changes to the code do need to be adopted by the county council. But then there were a couple of other questions as well about incentivizing builders and parking and that sort of thing. And that was where I thought I kind of let Jessica, might have some time. No, that's fine. That's perfectly. We're here to hear from you all, so that's great.
I do. The question of will affordable housing be built without government subsidies? I would say not in any scale. And I think, Aaron sort of tried to show some of the math. I mean, we're building, and Andrew talked a lot about, we are building high performing buildings too. They're either LEED certified or National Green Building Standard certified. They're fully Energy Star rated. We're putting, masonry exteriors on them. I mean, they have all of the bells and whistles. We did an analysis that we're building something like $20 a square foot more in cost than our competitors who are building market rate, conventional housing. So I think, we are building a durable product as well, a nice durable product that meets a lot of policy goals. So the expense of that, you're not getting that at market with the rents that we're charging. And so, yes, I think with the government, there is going to be some level of government subsidy, particularly when you get it to scale. And then the parking structures, it kind of goes back to the same conversation where they're expensive. I haven't done the analysis in a long time, but it used to be they were somewhere between $20,000 and $3,000, or $20,000 or $30,000 per parking space. So just depending upon how high you build, the system you use. We did actually do in Marley Meadows, we did actually have ground floor parking with 2 of the buildings. And I will tell you that was a very inefficient exercise, but we did to make it work. I want to say we had maybe 6 or 8 spaces in the 2 podium buildings, but also with insurance and fire, there's a lot of fire rating that happens between those 2 floors, and it just kicks you into a different code, which is also more expensive. So it's just an expensive.
And to be able to afford that, Jessica, I think you've got to be able to you've got to have the correct zoning in place that's going to allow you to put the number of units onto a site that will then pay for the make it pencil out to be able to afford to build that parking structure. And that applies to market rate housing as well. And so that's why you're not going to get a parking structure if the density, the allowable density, and what is being built isn't at a level that can really make that pencil out. Yeah. Michelle, I see you have your hand up, and then I think there may be some other questions as well. Let's hear from Michelle and her questions, and then take any others as well. So Michelle, are you, if I can get you to unmute, there we go.
Yep, I'm unmuting.
Great.
So I do want to piggyback on what Michael just said. I believe that about the incentives, I think that she didn't answer the question. More so like are there being the developers, are there any incentives for them developing? And that's the one question I want to ask, and then I want to go to the next one. I'd rather have a response, and instead of giving you 5 different questions. So, so are there any incentives with developers? Like if I was a developer and I wanted to develop, what are my incentives other than government subsidizing a program that they have? What would be the other incentives with the county would they give off to a developer?
Wait, I'm sorry, I make sure I understand. The question is, what in addition to financing subsidies, what are other incentives?
Yes, that's
Okay,
correct.
sure. I can, Patrick, can I take a shot at that and then others can
Mhm.
add in? So for example, one thing, and the county has some of these tools in the toolbox, like I was saying. One incentive would be an experienced nonprofit developer who would also own the property, who is developing that property, would get impact fees waived. So for example, Andrew works for Homes for America, which is an experienced nonprofit affordable housing developer. Currently, they would get all of their impact fees waived, which can, a lot of times impact fees, I don't know what the current average is, but I think the last time I looked into it, it was around 17,000 per unit. So if you're doing 100 units, that's big money that's knocked off the development cost. And one thing I'd like to explore is, I know we have, I really value our nonprofit development partners, but we also have some great for-profit development partners that really create, they're experienced and they create really good products. And so let's explore some kind of a tiered system where those experienced development partners, as long as there are restrictive covenants and deeds in place, maybe they get a discount on those impact fees as well. Another tool is that there's a water sewer development fees are waived for workforce housing developments. And so pretty much those perks are being applied to all affordable housing developments now, because most of these affordable housing developments meet the threshold for workforce housing. So that's another great perk. One thing others have, Jessica talked about the development timeline and how affordable units are kind of held to a different standard because of the financing that they bring in. One thing I would like to look at, or possibly explore in the future is, could we look at a streamlined development process for affordable housing developments? That could be another perk. And then again, one thing that we've already talked about would be the exemptions from school APFs for the limited number of affordable developments that are being developed. I'm probably forgetting some, and I'm sure Andrew and Jessica might have some more ideas.
Just to clarify what Aaron said, the water and sewer fees are reduced by half. So we do pay not the full amount, but it is reduced. So that's very helpful.
Yeah, and to give oh, sorry, Andrew,
no.
Go ahead. Are you finished?
I was going to just talk about the fact that generally speaking, there's not really other incentives besides Aaron's agency's ability to, offer loans to experienced developers. At times, the county is willing to reduce the real estate taxes, which allows for leveraging more debt on the property. That's known as a payment in lieu of taxes or pilot. But again, that's typically offered to an experienced developer. So for the most part, a market rate developer generally is not going to want to or be willing to rent or sell a home or an apartment below market because there's really not, an
Again,
economic benefit.
yes.
One other thing while I have the microphone was just to circle back to an important point that Mr. Young made, and that was about open space. And I had worked on a project in Odenton for probably almost 3 years, and we met and exceeded all the open space at that location. And I believe in addition to open space, we had to meet forest conservation and other things. So I don't think the photo that we shared was representative of that, but another project in Anne Arundel County had almost 40% of its acreage and open space to not only meet forest conservation, but also active and passive recreation. So although sometimes the school adequate public facilities is removed, generally we are still having to meet all the other standards, which includes having to provide open space.
And I would just want to give a little context to, when we're talking about these incentives or tax breaks or maybe some exemptions from certain things, we're not talking about, multiple developments usually. I think this year was an anomaly. I actually had, let's see, we had 3 new developments that we closed on in this calendar year, this past calendar year, I should say. That's pretty unusual that we would have 3 affordable housing developments closing in 1 year here in Anne Arundel County. We had a couple other ones that were redevelopments, and so those weren't new units that were taking advantage of some of these incentives. So the development opportunities, and largely because of land use and just the limited land that we have available for new development, is very limited, and the financing makes it difficult too. So we're not talking about huge numbers of developments here that are getting these incentives.
Okay, I just got another question also. Maybe for okay, so my question is, at the alarming rate of people coming out of school and alarming rate of people working inside of this area, and just in Glen Burnie, period. I wasn't really present for the whole and the whole thing. I wasn't present, so I don't know exactly what y'all all was talking about, but I definitely have a question about how soon or how effective are y'all going to be with developing more affordable housing in just Glen Burnie alone, because there's a massive need, which I know you guys know, but it's just so much and so many people, and they're all trying to get to just being stable. And in order to be stable, of course, they need affordable living. So I just want to know what that looks like in the near future. And I seen the models of how y'all planned. I mean, I guess in Odenton, but what does that look like for Glen Burnie?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I would say the development timeline can be long. And so even the ones that we have in the pipeline where we just closed on the pipeline on the financing, it's going to take a couple years. We haven't closed on financing in Glen Burnie on any projects recently, but we do have a project where we provided some property tax relief, the villages at Marley Station, which is, we were able to come in and work with the developer and ask county council for pilot tax reductions so that they could get the loan financing that they need to refinance on that. It was a new owner coming in. The tax credit liens that were on it that were requiring it to be affordable are about to expire. So the county getting involved and providing that tax relief is really helping them be able to take on more debt. And so that's preserving those units as affordable, which is really, really important. But we're still seeking new opportunities. I think in Glen Burnie, one of the things that's going to be really important is redevelopment and also preservation of existing affordable units. I think Glen Burnie has it may not feel like that to someone, to a lot of our residents who are working hard. Even the affordable units, I'm using quotes, they're still expensive, and I get that. But even so, those affordable units that maybe don't feel so affordable, some of them are at risk. And so we need to figure out ways to preserve those with some of the financing tools that we have, and then perhaps create new affordable units as infill or in redevelopment areas. And I do know, there have been some possible sites identified that are being explored for state financing and financing through us. So I do think there's hope. And we do have some tenant-based rental assistance programs. My agency is not the Housing Commission, so we don't offer housing choice vouchers. We work with them very closely, but that program is way oversubscribed. There's a huge waiting list. And so we're trying to use Affordable Housing Trust Fund dollars to come in and really help kind of close that gap for people, for tenants who are really struggling. So we're looking and exploring ways where we can maybe buy down some of the rent cost, because we know people are struggling. We run the county's eviction prevention program, and thank goodness it's still going. We just ran out of the federal treasury money. But thankfully our county is committed, our county executive and our county council members have invested through the Housing Trust Fund, and we're able to continue that program. But we know, like, a lot of the affordable units are in Glen Burnie, and a lot of the people that live there already are struggling. So I think you make a really good point, and I don't have a great answer, but I do know that some developments are percolating out there.
Okay, thank you.
Kristen, you've had your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
A quick question, and
Mhm.
it's more of an art of the possible type question. So is there any thought that we could look at our major employers in the region, whether it be the airport authority or the health systems or, the live casinos in Northrop Grumman's, and come up with a creative way by which maybe the employer is subsidizing housing for their employees and or residents, and that if they have land that could be used, that could fall under some grant process or something else. I mean, so kind of a bifurcated strategy that, hey, if we have a gift of land, and hey, if we want to, maybe salaries are changed, but we subsidize housing for individuals. Are there things like that major employers could collaborate with, some of your organizations and the county to say, how can we change the dynamic here?
Yeah, I would love employers if you have land. And actually, I just spoke with another of the small region planning groups last week in South County, and somebody was talking about partnerships with farmers and creating, affordable housing developments on farmland that could then support migrant workers and other farm workers. And I said, I would love to partner and do that. One of the things on my list is to reach out to the school system and see if they have any surplus land. We met with a developer or a financing nonprofit that has done similar projects in Texas, where they partnered with the school system and created affordable units on some school-owned property. So yeah, if employers have land, I can hook you up with our development partners, and or talk with you ourselves and talk about possibilities there. I think that I think the land is kind of another thing that we're exploring with faith-based groups. And oh gosh, Elisha, I see you're on the call. Elisha Herring-Blaine from my team is on the call. What did Lisa call that movement today?
Yes, in God's backyard.
Yeah.
Right.
So we've heard of NIMBYs, not in my backyard, but this is yes in God's backyard, and partnering with churches and other faith-based organizations, because we know that they have a lot of, parsonages and other underutilized pieces of land that can be used. And so one thing, we're partnering with the Office of Planning and Zoning. They have on their work queue to map all the land that's owned by faith-based groups. And so maybe that's another thing we look at, are the anchor institutions like the hospitals and the community college. And I don't know what that's going to yield, but I think that's a great idea.
It's a good point. Thank you for that, Aaron. I'm looking at our time now. We're coming up on we're just past 7:15, and I think what I'd like to maybe do is at this point steer us toward. We've got a couple of other slides to get through to kind of wrap on this conversation, but this isn't the end of the conversation here. What I'm going to recommend is I think there are a lot of other questions that people might have. I know, Michael, you probably spoke for everybody when you said you had like 10 questions that are stirred by this conversation. This has been a really great presentation. What I'd recommend is anybody on the committee who might have some additional questions, if you would send them to us at region3@aacounty.org, and we'll compile them and share them out with our speakers, and then see if we can get some responses and share them back with you. And that'll be very helpful when we come back to this topic and start to consider housing and how it also works with transportation, which is the topic of our next meeting. And then particularly when we get into our land use discussions, which is really where the rubber will hit the road there. So if I can, I'm going to share my screen really quickly again, if I can do that. And I'm going to, let me see. Okay, can everybody see my screen here? Let me get through a couple. I do want to point out very quickly, like Spencer shared earlier in his presentation, a lot of different counties and cities across the country, they are trying to address the issues of housing affordability and options and housing supply. And each context is kind of different from ours, but the underlying challenges can be very, very similar across the board. And so you've heard some examples in the news and elsewhere about communities that seem to be way ahead of us in some ways on addressing the issues. But I will point out there's not one silver bullet solution, and it's like some of our speakers had said, there's a whole toolbox of different tools that can come to bear to address this issue. Plan 2040 has a number of countywide housing goals, policies, and strategies. These are listed in that briefing packet that Jason emailed to you all. And so hopefully you had a chance to look at that. And you may want to go back and revisit that as well in light of this conversation. That may help you kind of jog some other questions that may come to mind, some things that may help you to understand a little bit better, to know more about as we start to move into some of these land use discussions and where we think different types of housing in the region may be appropriate. But basically, there are kind of four buckets of tools, or four categories of tools that Plan 2040 addresses. One is changes to the county code that can support more housing options. Changes to the development review process. We heard a little bit about that. Changes that would make it simpler and quicker and address timing conflicts with project funding. Financial incentives, we definitely talked about that. Making affordable housing projects more financially feasible, and then financial support for buyers and renters. And this is really the purview of ACDS and their programs. So these are some of the strategies that Plan 2040 does address things in these four buckets. And we don't necessarily need to repeat the strategies that are in Plan 2040 in our region plan. But if the SAC supports those broader countywide strategies, we can kind of include some general references to that support within our region plan. I will say, and we talked about this already, the biggest influence that the region plan will have on housing will be our recommendations to update our planned land use and our zoning maps. And that's going to really help guide where in the region we direct future housing and what types of housing, whether it's apartments or townhouses, those missing middle types that we talked about. And like I said, we had planned to do a breakout session where we could break you all into two groups to really focus on the eastern and western part of the region and start to talk about where different types of housing may be appropriate in the region. I want to hold that exercise at a time when we can meet in person and do it at that time, because I think it's a really important discussion for us to have and to get a temperature check on. So I guess with that, are there any other quick questions or comments before I turn it back over to Alyssa, who will open it up for our public comment period? And just to reiterate too, if you do have additional questions for our speakers, please go ahead and send them to us at region3@aacounty.org, and we'll compile them and see if we can get some input from our speakers. But is there anything else at this point from anyone? All right. Seeing nothing, then I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and I will let Alyssa, if you will open up the public comment period. We do have a few attendees.
All right, guys, it does look like we have 5 attendees that are in the Zoom call. If anybody is interested in giving public comment, you would have up to 2 minutes, and we can unmute you.
So I'm looking for any raised hands from the attendees.
And you didn't have any in advance, right?
No.
No.
Okay, I'm not seeing any raised hands, so. Okay.
All right, then. At this time, it's closed for public comment.
Okay.
Right?
that works. And I do have one, well, I had one other slide. I don't need to go back to sharing my screen again, but if I can share one announcement that I was going to make at the beginning, but had saved it till this point. We do have a public input session scheduled for January 30th. That's at the Severn Library, where we were supposed to meet tonight and couldn't. But that is where we're going to build on some of what we've heard in these committee discussions. That public input session will be focused on how some draft strategies for housing and also for economic development and redevelopment. I am going to go ahead. Sorry, I am going to go ahead and share my screen because we have this great graphic right here, a digital graphic. If any of you are interested in getting a digital graphic like this, maybe you can share it on Facebook or other social media platforms. Maybe you are head of your HOA or something of that nature and you want to email it out. Let us know. We'll get you this, and we would love for you to help promote this. So that's going to be January 30th at the Severn Community Library, 1 to 7 p.m. And then the only other announcement is our next SAC meeting, which will be February 13th. And that will focus on transportation. I think some people may have some thoughts on transportation in the region. So that will be a good one to come to. That's all that I had. Alyssa, anything more?
I don't have anything else. Stay safe tonight.
All right. a big thank you to our speakers for taking the time to join us and to help elucidate some of the very tough work that you all do. We thank you very much. And if we have any follow-up questions, we will reach out to you. And thanks to everybody, all of our committee members for your time. And I guess that's it. I guess that's a wrap for us for tonight.
Have a good night.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.